It was a Tuesday afternoon when I opened the sympathy card and realized I couldn't remember who gave it to me. The handwriting looked familiar, but the name didn't register. That's how far gone I was. Time had folded in on itself. The blinds hadn't moved in months, and the last place I'd seen my daughters was somewhere in the middle of the Gulf, somewhere I can't bear to name. 10 months of nothing, until that call came and said the ocean had brought something back. Before we start, hit subscribe to help uncover stories they tried to bury, and make sure no name stays forgotten. My name is Rachel Marin. I live in Charlottesville, Virginia. I'm 42 now, but at the time I was barely holding on to 39 and a half, raising my twin girls Millie and Rayleigh on my own. Their dad hadn't been in the picture for years, and honestly, that part was fine. We had our rhythm. I worked at the hospital night shifts mostly, so I could be with them during the day, and every spare dollar went into a jar labeled something better. That jar was supposed to be for a Disney trip, but when I realized I'd saved just enough for a 3-person cruise, I thought, why not give them something different? Something they'd remember. We'd never even seen the ocean before. So I booked the tickets, paid it all in cash. We left out of Tampa on a warm October morning, just the 3 of us. I still remember the way their hands gripped the ship's railing when we first pulled away from port. Millie had her little red Minnie Mouse shirt on, and Rayleigh kept adjusting her goggles like she was about to dive straight into the Gulf. They were 8 restless, chatty, full of that twin energy only they understood. The ship felt like magic to them. All-you-can-eat ice cream, a pool the size of our apartment building, live shows every night. It was the happiest I'd seen them in a long time. And for a little while, I let myself believe we were okay. We spent 3 nights on the ship. The 4th day started like all the others, breakfast on the deck, then swimming until the sun made our cheeks pink. I remember we stopped at one of the smaller cafes on board for lunch. It was a quiet spot around 3:30. Not many people around. That was the last normal hour I ever lived. A call came through on my phone, not a number I recognized, but it was from the hospital. I told the girls to stay put, just 5 minutes, I said. I stepped outside the cafe for better reception. The call turned out to be nothing urgent. But when I came back inside, the table was empty. At first I thought they'd gone to the restroom or maybe chased after the ice cream cart that rolled by every afternoon. But 5 minutes turned into 10, 10 into 20, and by the time I reached the ship's security desk, my hands were shaking so hard I could barely speak. That night turned into a blur of search teams' announcements over the PA and officers combing through every room. Cameras caught the girls at the poolside show that afternoon. But after that, nothing. It was like they vanished between one frame and the next. I went home alone. For 10 months I lived in that same house in Charlottesville, the girls' drawings still taped to the fridge, their backpacks untouched by the door. I printed hundreds of missing posters, filed every FOIA request I could manage. Every night I ran over the same questions: who was near them, who knew we were there, who watched us without me noticing. And then, last week, the phone rang. It was Detective Alvarez. His voice was different this time, careful. Too careful. He said a suitcase had washed up on a beach near Ocracoke Island, North Carolina. A local fisherman had found it. Inside were remains, and something else. He said I needed to come down in person. They were waiting for me. Detective Alvarez met me at the airport just after sunset. The air in North Carolina was heavier than back home, saltier, thicker. He didn't say much on the ride out to the sheriff's station, just handed me a bottle of water and nodded when I asked if it was far. I remember watching the trees pass in a blur of shadows and headlights, thinking how quiet everything felt for something this awful. When we arrived, they led us through a side entrance. The place looked more like a rural clinic than a law enforcement facility. Small rooms, buzzing fluorescent lights, every surface scrubbed down to that sterile beige that doesn't feel like any place at all. We stopped outside a closed door. Alvarez turned to me and said he needed me to brace myself. Then he handed me a set of gloves and a gown and a mask. I put them on with trembling fingers. My legs didn't feel steady, but I followed him in. The suitcase sat in the center of a stainless steel table. It was square, the kind people used before luggage had wheels. Its fabric used to be blue, maybe navy, but now it looked gray and brittle from sun and salt water. The edges were warped and one of the seams had started to split. The air in the room was cold, but carried something underneath it, something metallic like rust or wet coins. The man standing beside the table introduced himself as the medical examiner, but I don't remember his name. I only remember the way he opened the suitcase and gently pulled back the first layer of fabric inside. There were clothes folded but damp and mottled, then something heavier wrapped in a shirt. I knew it before I saw her face, or what was left of it. The red shirt was hers, Millie's, a faded Minnie Mouse print across the front. She'd worn it that day. She'd begged to wear it again after swimming even though it was damp. I told her to go ahead. The goggles were there, too, blue plastic with an M written on the side in marker. I had bought identical sets for both girls before we left. Rayleigh's had an R. That was how I knew. Even before they asked me for a DNA swab, I told them. That was my daughter. I stood there with my hand on the counter, steadying myself, while the medical examiner explained there were no signs of trauma. No broken bones, no visible injuries. They believed she died from asphyxiation quickly, he said. Quietly. Then he showed me something else. A clear evidence bag sealed. Inside was a silver Zippo lighter. The initials KE were engraved on the side. The sheriff asked if it belonged to either of my daughters. I shook my head. They were 8. They didn't own anything like that. I'd never seen it before. That's when the mood in the room shifted. Alvarez stepped closer and asked permission to photograph it with my phone. I said yes, then asked if I could take a picture too. There was a store logo on the bottom of the lighter, partially faded, a sticker like you'd find at a corner shop. I stared at that sticker longer than I should have. Something about it felt familiar, though I couldn't say why. The fisherman who found the suitcase stood quietly near the door. Curtis Bannister. He was maybe in his 50s, sun-baked skin hands that looked like they'd spent a lifetime pulling nets. He apologized when I met him. Said he wished it had been something else that washed up. I thanked him anyway, because at least he found her. He told me the suitcase had come in on the morning tide, just sitting on the wet sand. Said the smell was what caught his attention first. They asked if I'd be willing to stay in the area for a few days while they processed everything. I said yes. I wasn't ready to leave, not yet. I needed to see the beach myself, the spot where she came back. Curtis offered to take us on his boat. Alvarez didn't object. The ride was short, maybe 45 minutes, but it felt longer. The water was choppy, the wind kicking up enough spray to sting my eyes. I sat at the front, staring ahead at the shore as it came into view. When we reached the dock, Curtis helped me step off first. The sand was cold, not just from the air, but from what had happened here. The officers had preserved the site. A rectangle of yellow tape marked the depression where the suitcase had rested. The tide was farther out now, but I could still see how the sand dipped in that one place. I crouched beside it, running my fingers through the grains, hoping for something. A thread, a bead, anything. Alvarez came over and placed a hand on my shoulder. Said the forensic team had already done a sweep, but they'd keep looking. He walked away to talk to a news crew that had pulled up just as we arrived. Cameras were already rolling from a distance. I didn't look at them. Curtis stood beside me for a while, then offered to arrange a cabin for the night. A small place nearby, quiet. Said he knew the owner. I agreed. I wasn't ready to go back to Virginia. Not yet. The cabin was simple. 1 bed, a kitchenette. The porch faced the ocean with 2 Adirondack chairs sitting in silence. Officer Martinez stayed nearby, posted up as a precaution. Alvarez said until they knew what had happened to both girls, they wanted to keep someone close. Around sunset, I sat on the porch with a cup of coffee. The waitress who brought it didn't ask questions, just handed it to me with a soft smile. The waves kept coming in. I watched them without really seeing anything. Then something caught my eye movement across the gravel path. A man came out of the cabin across from mine, locking the door behind him. He was tall, early 40s, maybe wearing a windbreaker and carrying a duffel bag. He set the bag on the patio table for a second and turned back to double-check the lock. That's when I saw it. A cigarette pack, and next to it a lighter, silver, just like the one from the suitcase. I stood up and walked over, picked up the lighter, turned it over. The price sticker on the bottom, same logo, same placement. I caught up to him before he reached the office, told him he'd left something. He smiled, thanked me, took it back. I asked where he got it. He said some little shop in Greenville, Carnes Corner News. An old guy runs it, sells odds and ends, not part of any chain. Before I could ask more, a staff member came up behind him holding a suitcase. Said they'd found it in his room, asked if he wanted to take it with him. I froze. Same make, same color, same broken handle. I asked if I could have it. He shrugged and said sure. Said it was junk anyway. I asked his name, Jeff Thornton. He gave it willingly. When I told him I was there with the police and that my daughter had been found in a suitcase just like that, he went pale. Said he was sorry. Said he hoped they caught whoever did it. I took the suitcase back to my porch and called Alvarez. Told him everything about the lighter, the sticker, the store. He told me to stay put. 15 minutes later, he pulled up with Curtis in the passenger seat. I showed them both the suitcase. Alvarez examined it carefully, then called in to the station. The sticker matched the one from the evidence. The store was real. Carnes Corner News, owned by a Douglas Carnes. 3 locations, Greenville, Charlotte, and 1 opening soon in Virginia Beach. Alvarez didn't wait. He said we had daylight left, enough to check it out. We left the ocean behind, that broken suitcase still sitting on the porch. But I couldn't stop thinking about it, not just the match or the sticker. It was something in the way Thornton said it offhand, like it meant nothing, like that kind of suitcase could just come from anywhere. And maybe it could. But now we had a name. And I was starting to feel like someone had left us breadcrumbs. Not out of guilt, out of carelessness, out of habit. And one of those breadcrumbs had Millie's name all over it. We reached the kiosk just before closing. It sat on the edge of a strip mall lot, a squat box of faded white siding and a slanted metal roof, the kind of place you'd pass 100 times without ever noticing. Alvarez parked the cruiser off to the side, angled just enough to watch the front window. Inside, a thin man in his 30s was rearranging packs of gum and lottery slips, moving without much thought, like his body had memorized the routine. Alvarez stepped out first. I followed behind, slower still, holding the broken suitcase we'd picked up from the cabin. The clerk didn't look up until we were already inside. "Can I help you?" he asked, setting down a stack of cigarette cartons. "We're closing soon." Alvarez showed his badge. Virginia State Police. Asked if he was the owner. The man shook his head. Said no, he just worked the register. The owner was Douglas Carnes. Came in once a week, sometimes less. Moved between the other stores. Then Alvarez asked about the lighter. Showed him the photo on his phone, the one with the initials KE, engraved on the side. The clerk looked at it, nodded. Said yeah, they carried those. Same brand, same model. Customers sometimes brought them back in for engraving, but they didn't do that part in-house. When I asked about the suitcase, he hesitated. Said no, they didn't sell luggage, they were just a kiosk. Newspapers, snacks, maybe a few novelty items. Then he shrugged and added that sometimes Mr. Carnes brought in personal things to sell on the side. Said he didn't ask questions, just rang them up if someone wanted them. Alvarez thanked him, took one of the business cards from the counter. As we turned to leave, he told the clerk not to mention our visit to Carnes if he happened to come in. The man just nodded, already returning to his shelves. Back in the car, I asked if we could drive by the address listed on the card just to pass, nothing more. Alvarez agreed, though he made it clear we weren't doing anything beyond observation. No warrant, no confrontation, just eyes on the house. The drive took us through a quiet residential stretch, older homes spaced far enough apart to give each one a sense of privacy. When we slowed in front of the address, it didn't look like much. A pale yellow bungalow with white trim and a flag hanging limp on the porch. The lawn was cut, the hedges clipped. Nothing out of place. Then I saw the car in the driveway. The license plate. The first two letters, D and K. The last two, K and E. Alvarez leaned forward in his seat, watching. He didn't say anything right away. After a moment, he exhaled and sat back. Said we couldn't assume too much from a license plate no matter how close it felt. He was right. But I couldn't shake the feeling that we'd gotten closer to something. We stayed a few more minutes watching. No movement, no lights. Just the slow crawl of evening settling over the neighborhood. Eventually, Alvarez suggested we head back to the station. Said it was time to loop in the local authorities, take the next steps carefully. He offered to drive me to the ferry station, but when we got there, something caught my eye, a line of cars waiting to board. One of them, near the end, looked familiar. A dark sedan, same shape as the one we saw in the driveway. And then the plate DKKE. I leaned forward, heart pounding. Alvarez was already following my gaze. The windows were tinted, but we could just make out two silhouettes in the front. A third, smaller figure in the back. A child. I didn't think. I opened the door and got out. Alvarez called after me, told me to stop, but I kept walking. I needed to see. I moved toward the ticketing officer, who was checking each vehicle before letting them onto the ferry. As I got closer, I saw the driver's window roll down. A man leaned out, talking casually to the officer. Behind him in the back seat, a woman sat turned halfway around her arm, draped possessively across a child's shoulders. I only saw her face for a second, but I knew. Rayleigh. That profile. That hair. Even with her face angled away, even with the sun behind her, I knew my daughter. Alvarez caught up to me and took my arm. Told me we couldn't be certain. Said we needed to stay calm, follow protocol. I told him I was sure. That was her. He turned and walked briskly to the booth, spoke to the officer in charge. The man listened, nodded, then quietly signaled for the vehicle to pull over for a secondary inspection. The driver looked annoyed, gestured with his hands, then picked up his phone and started speaking fast. The woman in the back seat shifted, tightened her hold on the child. Then, without warning, the doors opened. The man bolted. The woman followed, dragging the child behind her. I heard Alvarez shout for backup. His voice over the radio was calm-clipped. Adult male, adult female, one child fleeing on foot. He signaled for me to stay put. Officer Martinez was suddenly beside me, her hand on my arm. The next few minutes blurred. Officers swarmed from both ends of the ferry terminal. Travelers were redirected cars blocked from moving. The man ran toward the fence, tried to climb it. Didn't make it halfway before he was pulled down and pinned. The woman was harder to track, cutting between vehicles, still gripping the child. "Let her go," one of the officers shouted. She hesitated. Then she did. The little girl twisted free and stood there, blinking, frozen in the middle of the chaos. And then her eyes met mine. "Mom!" That voice, I hadn't heard it in 10 months. But it hit me like thunder. I broke from Officer Martinez and ran. I didn't care who was watching. Didn't care what protocol said. I dropped to my knees and caught her in my arms, holding her so tightly I was afraid I might hurt her. But she didn't pull away. She clung to me with every bit of strength she had left. Alvarez came over a moment later. Told me they were both in custody. The man Douglas Carnes, the woman Kathy Evans. Husband and wife. The initials from the lighter. He said we needed to get Rayleigh to safety. Medical attention. Processing the suspects could wait. I didn't let go of her hand as the paramedics arrived. Even when they tried to check her eyes, when they lifted her sleeves, when she winced at the lights, I stayed right there. She didn't want her picture taken. She whispered that over and over. "Please, no pictures. Please stop." Alvarez returned with an update. The vehicle had been impounded. There were multiple suitcases in the trunk, boxes of magazines. Something in the back seat needles chemicals. They believed she had been sedated. Not heavily, just enough to keep her quiet, just enough to get her across the water. He watched me carefully when he said that. I didn't speak. Not yet. They lifted Carnes into one of the cruisers. I walked over before they shut the door. I didn't plan to, but something in me needed to see his face. I said, "You murdered my daughter." He looked at me completely flat. "I didn't mean to kill the other one," he said. "I wanted to keep both. But I couldn't manage two, and that was it. No apology, no fear, just facts like he was describing the weather." Alvarez stepped between us and told him to be quiet. Told me I didn't have to hear anymore. But it was already burned in. Every word. As the cruisers pulled away and the ambulance doors swung shut beside me, I climbed in with Rayleigh and held her hand. She was shaking, but her grip didn't loosen. Somewhere behind us, the water rolled on tide, pushing up against the dock. Rayleigh laid her head against my side and whispered. He said, "Millie was gone." And I told her I knew. But I didn't say it out loud. Not yet. There was too much left to uncover. Too much they still hadn't told us. The ride to the hospital was silent except for the hum of the road and the soft beeping of monitors beside Rayleigh's head. She stayed close to me, her small hand never letting go of mine, even as the paramedic adjusted the IV drip or lifted her sleeve to check her bruises. Her eyes darted every time someone opened the ambulance door or stepped into the light. She didn't speak much, just whispered once or twice that she didn't want any more pictures. I told her no one was taking pictures, that it was over. But she didn't answer. She just stared straight ahead, her face drawn and distant, like she was somewhere else entirely. The hospital room they brought us to was pale blue and too bright. Officer Martinez stayed in the hallway while a nurse gently asked me to wait outside during the first exam. I didn't want to leave her, not even for a moment, but I understood. They had to document everything, the bruises, the marks on her wrists, the signs of restraint. I sat on a plastic chair in the corridor, hands folded tight, listening through the wall for any sign that she needed me. A few times I heard her say no quietly or flinch at the touch of something cold. The nurse stepped out once to ask about allergies. I shook my head. Then the door stayed closed again. When they let me back in, Rayleigh was lying still under a blanket, her hair damp around her face. One of the nurses had brushed it back for her, but the cut was uneven, shorter than I'd ever let it go, jagged at the ends like someone had used dull scissors. Her eyes found mine the moment I stepped in. She didn't cry. She just reached out slow and uncertain, like she needed to be sure I was real. I sat down beside her and took her hand. The doctor introduced herself quietly. Dr. Patel. She was calm, professional, and careful not to stand too close to Rayleigh's bed. She said they were still waiting on a few results, but had enough to share preliminary findings. Rayleigh was underweight significantly. She'd lost over 20% of her body mass since her last pediatric record. Her body showed clear signs of malnutrition. There were bruises across her back and upper legs, thin, controlled marks, consistent with being struck by something narrow, maybe a belt. Her wrists and ankles showed healed abrasions, some still raw, likely from restraints used for long periods. What the doctor said next came slower. Rayleigh was reacting strongly to bright lights, especially flashes. She turned her head every time the exam camera clicked, flinched at the nurse's flashlight, even whispered for it to stop. Dr. Patel said it pointed to one thing: forced photography. Not the casual kind. She paused before saying it outright, then said it. I nodded. I don't think I really reacted, not out loud. I just kept holding Rayleigh's hand, watching her chest rise and fall. I asked what came next. Dr. Patel said she'd be started on a refeeding program, careful increments of nutrition over time. They had sedatives in her system still metabolizing. She'd stabilize physically with enough care, but the psychological impact, she said, would be long-term. They'd connect us with trauma specialists, recommend inpatient counseling once she was strong enough. I asked if I could stay in the room overnight. She said of course. Then she left us alone. Rayleigh drifted in and out of sleep through the night. Sometimes she twitched, murmured things I couldn't make out. A few times she reached out suddenly like something had startled her in a dream. I stayed close. There was a moment just before midnight when she sat up half awake and looked at me. "Millie's gone," she whispered. "Isn't she?" I didn't answer right away. I couldn't. I just brushed her hair back and told her I was here. That was all she needed in that moment. Eventually, she fell back asleep. Detective Alvarez arrived early the next morning. He looked tired. His shirt was wrinkled at the collar and he held a coffee he hadn't touched. He asked if we could talk in the hallway. I followed him out quietly, closing the door behind me. He said they'd started questioning Kathy Evans. She was talking. Carnes wasn't. But Evans was cooperative more than they expected. She wanted a deal, maybe leniency. Said she couldn't live with the guilt anymore. Said she never touched Rayleigh herself but helped keep her hidden. Alvarez said they weren't buying innocence, just building a case. He told me what she'd said about the cruise, about how Carnes got on board using a fake name and prepaid card, stole a maintenance uniform, disabled a security camera near the deck entrance where I'd last seen the girls. I leaned against the wall, steadying myself. I asked how he got them to follow him. Alvarez said Evans had asked that too. Carnes told her he'd watched them at a magic show, learned a few simple tricks from the performer. That day, when he found them alone outside the cafe, he used one. A card trick. Something harmless, just enough to get their attention. Then he led them through a side corridor down a crew hallway with fewer cameras. I didn't say anything, just pictured it. That red shirt, those goggles, Millie watching closely, Rayleigh laughing. They never even had a chance. Alvarez said Carnes planned to take both, but his original partner backed out, said 2 kids was too risky. Evans wasn't part of that decision, she only came in later. He told her he had to make a choice. And he did. He suffocated Millie in the cabin bathroom, quietly, no signs of struggle. Then wrapped her in her clothes and packed her into that suitcase. Alvarez said it was jettisoned overboard that same night from an unsecured service deck. When I asked how Rayleigh got off the ship, he said Carnes kept her hidden. Drugged just enough to stay quiet and slipped her off the boat in Key West during early morning disembarkation. Wore sunglasses, a fake beard, different clothes. Nobody noticed. They moved her through Florida, then North Carolina. Motel rooms, basements, even a trailer park for a few weeks. Always moving, changing her look, keeping her under just enough control to avoid suspicion. Evans said Carnes had a network. Not just him. Others. People who distributed what he produced. She gave names. Alvarez said they were already acting on it. I asked if Carnes had seen us before the cruise. Alvarez said yes. Evans remembered him talking about a pair of twins he'd seen in Virginia. Beautiful girls, he'd said. Perfect for what he wanted. That's when he started planning. That's when he bought the cruise tickets. That's when all of this really began. He told me the lighter found with Millie had belonged to Evans. Her initials, K.E. She lost it during cleanup and Carnes never noticed. It had been missing for months. I nodded. There wasn't much left to say. We stood there for a moment longer, neither of us moving. Then Alvarez said they were coordinating with federal agents now. Bigger jurisdictions. Cross-state warrants, seizure orders. They were going after everyone connected to Carnes. He told me Rayleigh didn't have to speak yet, not until she was ready. But when the time came, her statement could help bring down the whole operation. I said we'd do what we could. When I stepped back into the room, Rayleigh was just waking up, her face turned toward the window where the sun was starting to rise. She blinked a few times, then looked at me. Her voice was quiet. "You won't leave, right?" I sat beside her and shook my head. "No, baby. I'm right here." She reached for my hand and I gave it to her. That morning, before the nurses came back, I saw a small scar near her temple, faint but sharp at the edge. Something had broken the skin once, probably a belt buckle or a metal chain. It wasn't fresh, but it was there. I kissed her forehead gently, careful not to wake the pain. She closed her eyes again. There would be time for therapy, for statements, for the funeral I still hadn't planned. But in that moment there was just the hum of machines and the soft rise of her breath. Outside the window, the day kept moving. I watched the light shift on the wall, creeping upward inch by inch, and I waited for whatever would come next. The morning after Alvarez told me about Carnes' network, I stood by the window in Rayleigh's hospital room, watching the sky brighten in slow strips of gray and amber. She was still asleep, her hand curled near her cheek, breathing soft and even. The nurse had left a new tray of food toast, applesauce, scrambled eggs. None of it touched. I knew it would take time, but I also knew we didn't have the luxury of waiting on healing before the next move. Alvarez had promised they were working around the clock. He told me that federal agents were coordinating with state police, that they were close to identifying the other children Evans had mentioned. But until then, we were still operating in shadows. No addresses, no names. Just the word of a woman who had helped hide my daughter for nearly a year. It was around noon when Alvarez returned. He brought with him a folder, thin and neatly clipped, and asked if we could speak alone. I stepped out into the hallway with him. His voice was calm, measured, but I caught something different in his eyes, something more focused. He said they'd revisited all the evidence collected from the suitcase that held Millie. The clothing, the positioning, the objects packed alongside her. One item had gone overlooked at first, a paper fragment, small enough to have slipped between the seams. A receipt. The ink was mostly gone, waterlogged and faded from months at sea. But with forensic processing, they recovered a few partial lines, the end of a store name, a timestamp, and the last 4 digits of a merchant ID. It wasn't much, but it matched the point-of-sale system used at one of the Carnes Corner news kiosks, specifically the Greenville location. Alvarez said that confirmed 2 things. First, that the suitcase hadn't come from a thrift store like the clerk initially guessed. It had been sold through that shop, likely second-hand inventory passed off without records. Second, that the transaction had happened the same week Carnes boarded the cruise. He wasn't improvising. He'd planned ahead, bought the luggage, picked out the clothes, measured the risk, and somewhere in that timeline Evans's lighter ended up in Millie's bag. Not by design, she claimed. A mistake. She told investigators she noticed it missing weeks later. By then, Carnes had already told her one of the girls had been taken care of. I didn't respond to that. I just stared at the folder in Alvarez's hands. Then I asked him what else they had. He flipped open the cover and showed me a still frame from surveillance footage, grainy black and white. It showed Carnes mid-stride exiting the cruise terminal in Key West. He wore cargo pants, a light jacket, sunglasses. No facial hair, no hat. He didn't look rushed. Behind him, a child walked closely at his side, holding onto the strap of a backpack. Her face wasn't visible, but her size, her posture, it was Rayleigh. I knew it. I asked how that footage hadn't been found earlier. Alvarez said it had, but at the time, without identifying features or a license plate to track, they had no way to verify it was connected. Until now, it had been just another grainy exit among hundreds logged that day. Later that afternoon, the forensic team finished analyzing the digital sticker from the lighter, the store logo. A few identifying details on the back, nearly rubbed off, pointed to a third-party supplier out of Georgia that serviced small vendors across 3 states. Alvarez said they were reaching out to the supplier directly to request order logs, bulk shipping receipts, anything that could show who purchased specific product lots. It wasn't a silver bullet, but it could narrow the timeline, or link other stores connected to Carnes. What struck me most about all this was how easy it had been for him to blend in. The kiosk wasn't some seedy front tucked behind a warehouse. It was in a strip mall next to a hardware store and a diner. The man at the register was friendly if a little checked out. And the lighter, the one that helped identify them, had probably been sold as casually as a pack of gum. The rest of the day passed slowly. Rayleigh woke up for short stretches, drank a little apple juice, asked once if we were still at sea. I told her no, that we were in North Carolina now, that she was safe. She asked if Alvarez was still around. I said yes, that he was helping. Then she looked down at the IV line in her arm and asked if she could take it out. I told her not yet. When she drifted off again, I sat back and looked through my phone. Messages from friends I hadn't responded to. Missed calls from my sister. The battery had almost died. I plugged it in but didn't answer anything. My mind kept turning back to the receipt. That tiny scrap of paper trapped in the lining of a suitcase. Lost at sea for months. Somehow it held on. Like it knew we'd need it. Alvarez came back in the evening with a quiet update. He said that a clerk at the Greenville kiosk, the same man who spoke to us days earlier, had called in. Said Carnes had stopped by the shop that morning. Just showed up, acted normal. Bought a few items, didn't ask any questions. When he left, the clerk remembered Alvarez's request to stay quiet, but said something felt off. Like maybe Carnes had recognized that something was shifting around him. He told Alvarez Carnes looked at the cigarette display too long, didn't speak. Paid in cash, then left without saying goodbye, which he usually did. They were working on tracing his last known movements. His vehicle was impounded, so he must have been driving something else. Rental agencies had been notified. So had bus stations and regional airports. Alvarez told me not to worry, that they'd keep me informed. I asked if they had enough to tie him to a larger ring. He said Evans's testimony paired with the materials found in the car and what Rayleigh might eventually be able to share was building a strong case. But they needed to move carefully. They believed Carnes hadn't just worked alone, and whoever else was involved had likely gone underground the moment the arrest made the news. I sat with that for a long time after he left. I kept looking at Rayleigh's hands, the way her fingers curled slightly even in sleep. Her left thumb still bore the faint callus from where she used to grip her pencils. Her fingernails were shorter now, uneven. Someone had trimmed them carelessly. Her skin was dry, almost chapped, like it had spent too many nights without lotion or warmth. I reached out and held her hand gently in mine. That night I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about that receipt, the timestamp, the merchant ID, a transaction no one meant to leave behind. I pictured Carnes ringing it up himself, placing it in the bag, closing the zipper, not thinking twice. But the ocean gave it back, just enough to tell us where to start looking. The next morning, just before dawn, Alvarez called again. They had something new, a second property, different name on the deed. Belonged to a shell company connected to Carnes's brother-in-law. Alvarez said they were preparing a warrant. Quiet operation. He didn't want it leaked. I asked if they thought more children might be there. He didn't answer right away. Then he said, "We hope they are." And I understood what he meant. Better to find them now, before someone else made a choice like the one he made with Millie. I looked over at Rayleigh still sleeping, the sunlight just starting to touch her face. I told Alvarez we'd be ready. Whatever came next, we wouldn't look away. We left the hospital just after sunrise, the air still clinging to the last of the night's cool. Alvarez picked me up in an unmarked sedan, the kind with no plates and nothing inside except a scanner and 2 thermoses of burnt coffee. He didn't talk much on the way out of town. Just said the property was on Cedar Island, maybe 2 hours out, depending on the water. The house wasn't in Carnes's name. It belonged to a holding company that had changed hands twice in the past 3 years. But Evans had recognized a photo of the front porch. Said she'd never been there herself, but Carnes mentioned it once. Told her it was off-grid enough for the overflow. We drove in silence for most of the first hour. My mind kept going back to the photo Alvarez had shown me the night before Carnes, exiting the cruise terminal with Rayleigh beside him, her head down, her backpack sagging on one shoulder. I couldn't stop thinking about the way her hand must have felt in his. Whether she knew even then that something was wrong. Whether she looked back for me. When we reached the dock, a small boat was already waiting. 2 federal agents stood near the motor, nodding as we approached. Alvarez introduced me quietly, and I stepped on board without asking questions. The boat was too fast for my stomach to stay settled, but I didn't complain. We moved across the water in a straight line, wind whipping through our jackets. Cedar Island came into view like a gray smudge. It wasn't much to look at, just trees and scrub and a thin strip of sand where the marsh met the mainland. The house was tucked deep in, only visible when we got closer. 2 stories, weathered siding, no curtains on the windows. 1 chimney, no visible power lines. I counted 3 outbuildings as we approached. The agents had timed it to coincide with the shift in morning tide. Soft ground, easier access, fewer people out. Alvarez and I stayed behind as the entry team moved in 8 officers, quiet, efficient. No sirens. No announcements. Just motion. The front door wasn't locked. They breached at 7:12 a.m. What followed was a stretch of time I'll never be able to measure properly. Minutes that felt like hours, or hours that collapsed into seconds. I watched from behind the tree line with Alvarez. He had a radio in one hand, binoculars in the other. He narrated in short bursts. First room clear, back hallway clear, then basement secured, then nothing for a long time. Then we have movement. Multiple juveniles located. 2 appear conscious. I didn't speak. I just kept watching the house. A light came on in an upper room, flickered once, then went out. 2 minutes later, an officer stepped out onto the porch, his face pale, his lips moving quickly into the radio. Alvarez listened, then stood still for a long time. He looked over at me and said, 3 children, all alive. I don't remember walking toward the house. I just remember the front door swinging open and the smell hitting me first. Not filth, not blood, just something stale, like a space that had been shut too long. Inside, the walls were stripped bare. Plastic sheets hung from one side of the stairwell. The furniture didn't match. Nothing soft. No toys, no pictures. A small girl sat on the floor of the living room, a blanket wrapped around her shoulders, her knees pulled to her chest. An officer crouched beside her, speaking low. Another child, maybe 10, stood behind the staircase, peeking out, then disappearing again the moment he saw me. The third was upstairs. They said she'd been locked in a closet with a chain across the outside. She didn't say anything at first, just clung to the EMT who carried her out, her cheek pressed against his jacket like she was trying to disappear into it. Her hair was matted, one eye swollen shut, but she was breathing. All 3 of them were. The officers moved quickly after that, room by room. One of the sheds out back had been converted into a dark room. Red bulbs strung from the ceiling rolls of undeveloped film stacks of envelopes labeled with dates and cities. Alvarez didn't let me see inside. He told me it was better I didn't. But I caught a glimpse of a calendar on the wall as they came out, July 1984, scribbled across the top. A different year, a different victim, a timeline none of us had been prepared for. Evans had said Carnes wasn't the only one. And now we knew she wasn't lying. There were names in those files. Names they were starting to cross-reference. A handful were flagged missing in multiple states. Others had never even been reported. Alvarez said they'd need weeks, maybe months, to sort it all. The house was sealed off by noon. The children were airlifted to a secure pediatric care unit under assumed names. One of the agents told me it was safer that way. No media, no mistakes. I returned to the hospital that evening and sat beside Rayleigh again. She looked better. Her skin had more color. She ate half a banana. When I told her we found more children, she just nodded like she already knew. Then she whispered, "Did they have to stay in the dark too?" I told her yes, but not anymore. That night as she slept, I stood at the window again. The sky had gone clear for once, no haze, no clouds, just stars, the kind you only notice when everything else goes quiet. Alvarez called just after midnight. Said the files recovered from Cedar Island matched with packaging found in the trunk of Karn's car, that it was all connected. Same source, same labels, same print codes. They were preparing a full timeline starting from his first known appearance in Virginia and moving outward. I asked how far back it went. Alvarez didn't answer right away. Then he said, "Longer than we thought." I watched the sky a while longer after that. Somewhere on a porch I couldn't see Millie's shirt was probably still drying. Folded once. Left behind. A memory repackaged by a man who didn't care what it cost. But the ocean had given her back, and now the rest of his world was starting to collapse. In the morning I planned to speak with the prosecutors, but that night I just listened to Rayleigh breathe, and for the first time in nearly a year, the house felt still. It was just after noon when Alvarez knocked on the door to Rayleigh's room again. His voice was quiet when he asked if I could step into the hallway for a moment. There was no urgency in his face, but something in the way he didn't meet my eyes told me he wasn't just bringing an update. We stood by the vending machine next to an old payphone that had probably been dead for years. Alvarez held a thin envelope in one hand. He said Micah came in. I didn't recognize the name at first. Then he clarified Micah was Carnes's nephew. Estranged from the family, apparently. Hadn't spoken to Carnes in over a decade. Said he came forward after seeing the broadcast Rayleigh's recovery, the Cedar Island raid. Said he recognized something. Micah lived 3 counties over and had never spoken publicly about his uncle, but after the story broke, he told investigators he couldn't shake the memory of a locked room in the basement when he was a child. The family said it was for storage. He remembered being told not to go near it. But once, when he was about 7, the door was cracked open during a holiday visit and he saw what looked like a bed frame inside. Just a frame. No mattress. No sheets. But someone had written on the far wall in thick black marker. He didn't remember the words, just that they were uneven like a child had written them quickly. When he asked about it later, he got spanked for snooping. His parents didn't return to the house after that. Micah brought photos. Not from that time, but more recent. He said his uncle had given him a laptop once, maybe 10 years ago, second-hand, no charger. He never used it, just boxed it away in storage. When he heard the name Carnes on the news, he dug it out, brought it to the local precinct. Tex pulled the hard drive and found hundreds of image files, most of them encrypted or corrupted. But one folder stood out. It was labeled Camp. Inside were scanned Polaroids, location data, handwritten notes. Most of it was fragmented. But what caught Alvarez's attention was a series of childlike sketches done in crayon or pencil. The backgrounds looked familiar. One resembled the Cedar Island house, another a dock. But one sketch was unmistakable. It showed a woman standing alone in a kitchen, her face turned away. And next to her a girl in a yellow shirt holding what looked like a toy bird. The details were crude, but Rayleigh used to carry a wind-up hummingbird when she was 4, the exact same shape. Alvarez asked if I wanted to see the file. I said no. I already knew what it meant. He nodded and moved on. Said they were organizing a quiet search of a secondary residence tied to Carnes's sister, a cabin outside Durham that hadn't been used in years. Evans had never mentioned it, but the sketches in the folder seemed to match its interior. A spiral staircase, chipped tile, a cellar door with a rusted hinge. The timeline wasn't clear, but the images suggested activity there at least 5 years earlier. Alvarez said they weren't expecting to find anyone now, but maybe something had been left behind. I went back into Rayleigh's room and sat with her while she napped. She'd drawn a little that morning, nothing detailed, just scribbles and lined circles with faces in the corners. But there was one drawing I kept coming back to. A house with no windows, just a door and 4 stick figures standing outside. One of them was holding a leash. I asked her who the people were. She didn't answer, just looked out the window like she didn't hear me. That evening, Alvarez called again. They had confirmation on the handwriting from the Cedar Island calendar. It matched letters Carnes had sent back in the 80s postcards addressed to his brother from youth retreats, summer camps. The style was distinctive, slanted upward heavy pressure. The ink from the calendar matched one of the labels recovered in the shed. Same pen, same hand. Alvarez said they were treating the darkroom materials as primary evidence in a multi-state child exploitation case. The FBI had taken over the archive. For now, they were keeping it out of the press. I asked if they knew who the 3 children from the island were. He said they had partial matches on 2 runaways from Georgia and South Carolina, both gone for months without follow-up reports. The third, a girl maybe 7 years old, hadn't spoken yet. No name, no identifier. Just clung to the nurse and cried when anyone else approached. They were calling her Lily, just for now. Something soft, something hers. Alvarez said the team was working on cross-referencing DNA with open cases from the past decade. No matches yet. I asked if she'd be safe. He said yes. As safe as we can make her. Later that night, I sat on the edge of Rayleigh's bed and looked at the band on her wrist. Her full name spelled correctly. Date of birth, medical record number. A year ago, I'd carried that same information in my purse on a laminated card tucked behind my license. I used to glance at it when I traveled, just in case something happened. But I never thought it'd be used like this. The laptop Micah brought in it had more than sketches. There was one document buried deep in the drive, unmarked, no title. Investigators cracked it open with a forensic tool. Inside was a typed letter, never printed, never sent. It wasn't addressed to anyone, just a series of paragraphs, disjointed and rambling. But one section stood out. It described the little one with the scarf who didn't cry until the 3rd night. Said she reminded him of a stray kitten. Said he almost let her go. I didn't ask who wrote it. I didn't want to see the rest. But I asked Alvarez to forward that one page to the district attorney. He said it might help secure the chain of custody. I said that was fine. But really, I just needed someone else to read it and feel the same cold in their stomach. Rayleigh woke up once in the middle of the night, sweaty and disoriented. She asked for water, then whispered something I almost didn't catch. She said, "He wore gloves when he was mad." I didn't press her, just held her hand and told her she didn't have to remember anything else that night. That we were done remembering for now. Outside, the streetlight buzzed in the dark. The window had started to fog a little from the AC. I looked out at the empty parking lot and realized I hadn't thought about Jim in days. The grief was still there, but it had curled inward, muted by something heavier. What mattered now wasn't why he left us. It was that Rayleigh came back. In the morning, we'd be meeting with a child advocate. I didn't know what Rayleigh would say or if she'd say anything. But I did know this someone had started telling the truth. And it wasn't the adults. It was the children, the drawings, the words no one taught them, but they wrote anyway. And now someone was finally listening. We met the prosecutor the next morning. Her name was Dana Pierce, mid-40s. Quiet, no makeup, just a small gold pin on her lapel, and the kind of voice that didn't waste syllables. She'd been assigned to the task force overseeing multi-state charges tied to Carnes and whatever network had enabled him. She didn't ask me to retell anything. She just thanked me for staying close to Rayleigh and said she'd walk us through what was coming next. By then, the evidence was overwhelming. 37 labeled envelopes from the Cedar Island Darkroom 6 matched to known missing children, 2 confirmed deceased. Dozens of contact sheets showing identical staging across locations. The FBI had retrieved additional files from a second property. Micah had led them to it, a metal storage unit off a service road 20 miles inland. Inside, they'd found archival tape children's clothing photo negatives. One of the uniforms had Rayleigh's name stitched into the collar. That was enough for Pierce. She said the state would charge Carnes with multiple counts of unlawful imprisonment, aggravated child abuse, and possession of child pornography. Federal prosecutors were moving forward with conspiracy and trafficking. The timeline stretched back 16 years, possibly longer. Carnes had never acted alone. Pierce was blunt about that. She didn't speculate, didn't drift. Just said, there were people who knew. Maybe not everything, but enough. The digital evidence suggested the materials had been sold or traded, not just kept. Tracking that web would take months, maybe years. But she promised it wouldn't disappear into a drawer. They had enough now to keep Carnes locked up for the rest of his life. He was being held without bail under suicide watch. The court had approved a closed pretrial hearing. No cameras, no press. Back at the hospital, Rayleigh had been moved out of ICU into a private room down the hall. The nurses decorated the walls with soft-colored decals, clouds, little bears. She liked the turtle best, said its eyes looked sleepy like hers felt. She still didn't talk much, but she let me brush her hair. She asked about Grandma Doris once, said she wanted her pink slippers. I drove home that afternoon to get them. The house was cold, quiet in the way only an empty home is, the kind of quiet that makes the refrigerator hum sound like a scream. I moved through the rooms slowly. In the hallway closet, I found her slippers tucked beside a rolled-up beach towel. I stood there a while, holding the fabric. It still smelled like lavender. When I walked into the kitchen, the answering machine light blinked once. Just one message. I pressed play. A voice I didn't recognize said, "You should have stopped digging." Then the line went dead. I froze. My first thought wasn't fear, it was disbelief. It had been months since we'd had any calls. The number wasn't listed. I checked the caller ID, blocked. I called Alvarez from the porch. He didn't ask me to repeat it, just said, "We'll get someone over there. Don't touch anything else." I waited outside until they arrived. They dusted the phone, checked the line, pulled surveillance from the nearest intersection. Nothing. Whoever called knew the gaps in our security. Alvarez didn't say it, but I could tell it unnerved him. "We think it's a message," he said. "Someone's still watching, still connected." The investigation wasn't over. If anything, this was confirmation that the rot spread wider than Carnes. 2 days later, the court convened for Carnes's first hearing. I wasn't there. Pierce told me I didn't need to be. He pled not guilty, but the judge reviewed the case file, saw the evidence, and ruled him a danger to the community. No bail, no release. Media outlets had begun circling by then, national coverage, true crime podcasts, morning shows. I declined all interviews. I didn't want Rayleigh's name on the air. I didn't want hers to be the face they plastered next to his. That night I sat with Doris in her den, the TV off. She asked if I believed in evil. I told her I didn't know. She said she used to think monsters wore masks. Now she thought they wore kindness. They shook your hand, smiled at your child, offered to help carry groceries. Then they vanished when you turned your back. But evil, she said, doesn't mean we stop showing up. It just means we hold the line tighter. Later that week, Micah came by the hospital. He brought a sealed box, one of Carnes's old journals, said it had been mailed to him 2 years ago with no return address. He never opened it, said he didn't want to know, but now he thought we should have it. Pierce reviewed the contents, dates, names, references to training. Pages marked with initials, at least 4 correspondents. One of them was a known caseworker from another state. Disbarred quietly, never prosecuted. The kind of person who passed inspections but never asked questions. I remember holding that journal and feeling like I'd stepped into someone else's nightmare. Like I was living inside the footnotes of a horror story no one wanted to claim. But it was real. It was happening. And it wasn't over. Rayleigh smiled once that week. Just once. We were walking in the therapy garden and she saw a butterfly land on her arm. She watched it a long time, then whispered, "It tickles." It felt like oxygen rushing back into the world. There's no roadmap for what comes after justice begins. No instructions for how to rebuild a child's trust or your own. But the wheels were turning now. Evidence, logged warrants, sealed names quietly passed to grand juries. Alvarez told me there would be more arrests. Some people would lawyer up. Others would vanish. But they weren't going to stop. Not this time. The last thing Pierce said before leaving that day stuck with me. She said, "Survivors don't always get peace, but they get truth. And truth burns slow, but it reaches everything." I didn't know then just how far that fire would spread, but something told me it wasn't done yet, and neither were we. Rayleigh still sleeps with the lights on. Not every night, but enough. Her room at my mother's house is smaller than she's used to, but she picked the paint color herself. Pale yellow, the kind that looks like butter in the morning light. We kept the old turtle decal from the hospital. It's stuck now on her closet door, a little faded around the edges. She talks more now. Not about everything, but about the garden and school and which bird feeders work best in winter. Some days she even laughs. Millie's name still lives in our house, on the photos taped to the fridge, in the stories we say out loud when we're ready. Doris planted 2 dogwoods in her memory side by side in the front yard. The one on the right bloomed early this spring. It made us all stop for a second. That quiet kind of stop. Just long enough to feel it. The trials are still ongoing. Carnes pled guilty before the first jury was seated. He'll die behind bars. The ones who helped him, the ones who knew and said nothing. Most of them are still being brought in. One got a reduced sentence for turning over a list. Another fled the country before the arrest warrant reached their door. Pierce said some may never be found, but the chain was broken. The circuit dismantled. And that means something. Not everything, but something. Micah moved out west. Last I heard, he's working on a horse ranch, no phones, no noise. He never asked for credit. Just said he wanted her safe. I believe him. Alvarez retired 2 months after the last conviction. He sent Rayleigh a postcard from Montana. She keeps it tucked into a book of sea animals. Says she likes knowing where he is. I do too. I still work nights sometimes. The house feels better when it's moving dishwasher, running dryer, humming floor creaking under your steps. It reminds you you're still here, that you lived through it, that something was taken, yes. But something was saved too. And what was saved still matters. I used to think healing meant erasing, that one day the memories would get quieter or lighter. But they don't. Not really. They just take shape. They settle into the corners. Some days they ache. Some days they warm. I don't run from them anymore. I just let them ride in the passenger seat. Rayleigh has a box now. She calls it her truth box. Inside are postcards, drawings of seashell from Ocracoke, a photograph of Millie with cotton candy on her nose. There's space in that box for the things we don't understand yet, for the things we hope will come. She said once, "This box isn't for forgetting. It's so I don't have to carry everything in my hands." That stayed with me. So here's what I've learned. We don't get to choose how the darkness enters our lives, but we get to choose what kind of light we hand down. And sometimes that's enough. Sometimes one small voice speaking truth is all it takes to break the pattern. If this story stayed with you, share it, so no name gets left behind.